In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the once formidable German arms industry, which had driven the creation of some of the most advanced weaponry in history, faced a fate marked by widespread dismantling, repurposing, and uncertainty. The vast network of factories, production lines, and research facilities that had supported the Nazi war machine were now in the hands of the victorious Allied forces. With the cessation of hostilities, these sites no longer held strategic or military value for Germany, and their future became subject to decisions driven by the demands of occupation, economic pressures, and the emerging Cold War dynamics. The scale of the destruction in Germany's industrial heartland was staggering. Major cities like Berlin, Essen, and Munich were heavily bombed, and many factories had been reduced to rubble or were severely damaged. The war had not only decimated the workforce but also left behind a complex and broken infrastructure. Thousands of factories that had once produced tanks, aircraft, and armaments were now abandoned or turned into ruins, with much of the remaining machinery obsolete or unusable. However, a considerable portion of the war economy had remained intact, especially in the more rural or less targeted areas, where entire industrial districts were still functional, albeit under new and uncertain conditions. The Allied occupation authorities, tasked with the monumental challenge of rebuilding Europe, initially took a pragmatic approach. They viewed the German arms factories through the lens of demilitarization. The goal was not only to destroy Nazi military capabilities but also to prevent any resurgence of German militarism. For the Americans, British, French, and Soviets, this meant dismantling weapons production entirely or converting the facilities for peaceful uses. The first few months after Germany's surrender in May 1945 were marked by large-scale assessments of what remained. Economic factors played a crucial role in shaping the decisions that followed. Germany, divided into occupation zones, faced significant material shortages. The entire economy was in ruins, and there were immediate pressures to repurpose resources to meet the basic needs of a shattered population. The U.S., which controlled the Western zones, found itself trying to balance its vision of post-war recovery with the pragmatic demands of restabilizing the region. In the Soviet-controlled Eastern Zone, the situation was even more dire, and the demands for reparations were immediate. The Soviet Union sought not only to dismantle German industrial power but to carry away as much equipment and raw materials as possible to fuel its own rebuilding efforts. This included entire factories, machinery, and even intellectual property related to military production. In the West, the Allies began the process of dismantling many of the arms factories. Under the directives of the Allied Control Council, which governed Germany's occupation, large portions of the arms production infrastructure were either destroyed or disassembled for scrap. The rationale behind this was clear: a complete breakdown of Germany's war-making potential. Among the most notable examples was the dismantling of the massive Krupp armaments complex in Essen. Krupp had been one of the largest and most important producers of weapons in Nazi Germany, supplying tanks, artillery, and munitions to the military. In the post-war period, however, the complex was systematically disassembled, and many of its assets were shipped to the Soviet Union as part of reparations. The Germans, now under occupation, were left with a diminished ability to rebuild such industries on their own, even as the Western zones began to focus on rebuilding civilian infrastructure. The initial focus on stripping Germany of its war potential meant that many factories were left idle or scrapped altogether. Yet, the scale of this operation proved problematic. Dismantling and transporting entire factories was an enormous undertaking that often proved more difficult than anticipated. For example, the enormous Siemens and AEG factories, which had been central to the production of electronics and military technology, could not be fully dismantled or relocated. These factories, while heavily damaged, were deemed too valuable to simply destroy. As a result, many of these sites were slowly repurposed for civilian production, a process that took several years to fully unfold. In some areas, especially in the Western zones, there were growing tensions between the desires of the occupying forces and the economic realities of post-war recovery. The Allies, particularly the United States, recognized the importance of rebuilding Germany's industrial base to prevent the spread of communism, which was gaining momentum in Eastern Europe. This tension would become more evident as the Cold War began to take shape. The United States and Britain gradually shifted away from complete dismantling, focusing instead on rebuilding a stable and functioning German economy. Factories that had once produced weapons were now converted to produce consumer goods, such as automobiles, electronics, and machinery. In particular, the automotive industry, centered in cities like Stuttgart and Wolfsburg, became a key example of this transition. The conversion of factories to civilian production would later become a cornerstone of the economic miracle in West Germany during the 1950s. Nevertheless, not all factories were repurposed so easily. Many of the smaller, more specialized factories, particularly those focused on armaments, could not be easily converted to civilian use. The larger industrial complexes were more adaptable, but they faced their own set of challenges. Some factories, particularly those in the Eastern Zone, remained largely dormant for many years, as the Soviet Union focused more on stripping the region of resources than on rebuilding it. For example, in places like the industrial center of Schapau, production ceased entirely, and the site remained abandoned for the early years of the post-war period. In addition to the physical dismantling and repurposing of factories, there was the matter of the workforce. The war had decimated the labor force, and many skilled workers had either perished or were displaced. Additionally, the Allies imposed harsh restrictions on the employment of former Nazis, including those who had worked in the arms industry. This made the transition to a civilian economy even more difficult. The remaining workforce, which had often been forced into labor for the Nazi regime, was now left in limbo. The post-war era saw many of these individuals subjected to a complex system of reparations, forced labor, or, in some cases, imprisonment. The Soviet occupation zone, in particular, carried out aggressive purges of former Nazi officials and workers, while the Western zones were more lenient, allowing many former workers to find new roles in the civilian economy. Despite the challenges, the process of dismantling and repurposing Germany's arms factories began to stabilize by 1947. Yet, the full scope of the transformation was still unfolding. The recovery of German industry would not be a straightforward path, and the ultimate fate of the factories and their workers remained uncertain. Some would eventually become part of the foundations of a new, democratic Germany. Others would be forgotten, their stories lost to time, as the country rebuilt and redefined itself in the shadow of the Cold War. The repurposing of these facilities, while essential to post-war recovery, came with its own set of complex legacies that would take decades to fully understand. Following the initial phases of dismantling, repurposing, and abandoning much of Germany's arms production infrastructure, the fate of these factories entered a period of transition marked by difficult decisions and shifting priorities. By the late 1940s, the process of converting industrial facilities for civilian purposes had gathered momentum, particularly in the Western zones under Allied occupation. This period was pivotal in reshaping Germany's industrial landscape and would also prove crucial in the broader context of Europe's post-war recovery. By the end of the 1940s, the focus of the Allied authorities shifted from purely dismantling Germany's war industry to rebuilding and stabilizing its economy. This was driven not only by the need for economic recovery but also by geopolitical considerations. The rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower and the emerging Cold War dynamics placed significant pressure on the Western Allies to foster a strong and stable Germany that could counterbalance communist influence in Europe. The Marshall Plan, introduced by the United States in 1948, was a turning point in this regard. This program, which provided significant financial aid to rebuild war-torn Europe, also included provisions that allowed Germany, particularly the Western zones, to reindustrialize. In the Western zones, the repurposing of former arms factories was central to this recovery. Factories that had once churned out tanks, aircraft, and munitions were now tasked with producing consumer goods, many of which were desperately needed to address the everyday needs of the population. Some of the factories, particularly those in the automotive sector, became engines of post-war economic growth. One of the most prominent examples of this transformation was the conversion of the Volkswagen factory in Wolfsburg. Originally a key producer of military vehicles like the Kübelwagen and the Volkswagen Type 82, the plant quickly shifted gears to produce civilian vehicles. The production of the iconic Volkswagen Beetle, which became one of the best-selling cars of the 20th century, began in the late 1940s. This shift was emblematic of the broader trend in the Western zones, where the transition from military to civilian production was not only possible but also successful in a relatively short period. The same process occurred in other sectors of the economy. In the Ruhr Valley, once the heart of Germany's coal and steel industries, many of the factories that had been used to produce arms were gradually converted to civilian uses. For example, the Krupp Steelworks, which had been a linchpin of Germany's arms production, became a key supplier of steel for civilian infrastructure projects. Krupp's expertise in heavy manufacturing and steel production proved essential in the reconstruction of post-war Europe. Similarly, the machine-building industry, which had once produced military hardware, was redirected towards the production of machinery for civilian industries. However, not all factories found such easy conversions. The smaller, more specialized plants that had been focused on advanced military technology faced greater challenges. Factories that had produced sophisticated weaponry, such as anti-aircraft guns, submarines, and guided missiles, were not easily repurposed for civilian use. These facilities were often too specialized and technologically advanced to simply be turned into civilian manufacturing plants. As a result, many of these factories either remained dormant or were abandoned altogether. In some cases, they were sold off or handed over to private companies, but this was a slow and difficult process. In the Soviet-occupied zone, the situation was different. The Soviets pursued a more aggressive approach to extracting reparations, taking large amounts of industrial equipment, raw materials, and intellectual property back to the Soviet Union. Entire factories were dismantled and transported to the east, with the goal of rebuilding the Soviet war industry. In many cases, this extraction of resources left behind empty and decaying industrial sites in the eastern part of Germany. The Soviets also imposed their own industrial policies, which were geared toward creating a socialist economy in the eastern zones. These policies often involved centralization and state control of industrial production, which made the process of repurposing former war factories more rigid and less adaptable to civilian needs. While the Soviets extracted resources for their own needs, the Western Allies took a more measured approach. By the early 1950s, the United States and Britain had largely stopped dismantling industrial plants, choosing instead to help build up the economy in the Western zones. This shift in policy was largely due to the realization that a functioning industrial base was necessary not only for economic recovery but also for the stability of Western Europe. The establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949 marked a significant milestone in this process, as the new government sought to rebuild the country's industrial capacity while dealing with the legacies of the war and occupation. During the 1950s, as Germany's industrial base began to recover, the country's arms industry slowly re-emerged. However, the nature of the industry was fundamentally changed. The Federal Republic of Germany, in alignment with the policies of the United States and NATO, adopted a defense posture that focused on the integration of Germany into the Western security framework. This meant that while the country began to rebuild its military capabilities, its arms industry was now under strict regulation and oversight. The production of heavy weaponry, tanks, and aircraft was curtailed, and much of the focus shifted to smaller arms and ammunition, as well as the production of equipment for NATO forces. The fate of individual factories that had once been dedicated to the production of war material varied. Some, like the Krupp Works, managed to transition into civilian production, while others were either repurposed or abandoned altogether. The sprawling complex in Essen, for example, which had produced armaments on an industrial scale during the war, was eventually absorbed into the larger landscape of post-war industry, though its military production was forever curtailed. In contrast, other sites were simply abandoned, left to decay as the country turned its attention to rebuilding and modernizing. In the eastern zones, the Soviet Union's approach was somewhat more straightforward. The factories were dismantled, and their assets were transported east. The extraction of intellectual property also played a key role in this process. Research and development related to military technologies were transferred to Soviet scientists and engineers, who were tasked with adapting and further developing German innovations. This included advanced rocket technology and jet propulsion systems, much of which had been pioneered by German engineers during the war. This transfer of knowledge and technology would play a crucial role in the development of the Soviet military-industrial complex. In the decades that followed, the legacy of Germany's wartime arms factories became increasingly difficult to trace. Many of the factories were simply absorbed into the fabric of post-war industrial society, while others were forgotten or repurposed for entirely different uses. Some of the largest factories were repurposed for civilian industrial production, contributing to the so-called German economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s. The country, now divided between East and West, faced different challenges in dealing with its industrial past. In the West, industrial production surged, driven by the reconstruction efforts and the integration of Germany into the global economic system. In the East, the economy stagnated under Soviet control, with many of the former war industries left in disrepair or neglected. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, many of the former arms factories had been either repurposed or dismantled entirely. The complex process of converting wartime production into peacetime industry had left its mark on the German industrial landscape, but the war's legacy was increasingly hard to discern. The once thriving factories that had been central to Germany's military might were now relics of a bygone era, either repurposed for civilian use or forgotten in the annals of history. In the years since, many of the factories that once served the military have been demolished, replaced by modern office buildings, residential areas, or commercial zones. Some, however, remain as industrial monuments, reminders of a time when Germany's war economy was at its peak. These sites, now often forgotten, tell a quiet story of transformation, of a country rebuilding itself in the shadow of the war that once consumed it.